and welcome to Flute Tube. Today's episode was inspired by Carolina, a student I worked with this past spring. Among other things, Carolina and I were looking at a piece called Andalus by Emile Pissard, and we realized that there are a lot of runs in this piece that slowly wend their way up to a high E. And that's very difficult to get to the high E and make it sound just as good as all of the other notes. I was reassuring Carolina that this happens to everybody, that high E is just very reluctant to speak, and especially to speak just as well and clearly as all of the notes leading up to it. So thank you, Carolina, for the inspiration for this episode. I told her this is exactly why we have a split E mechanism on the flute to help in this kind of circumstance, because it's hard for everybody. And we realized that there may be many people out there who have no idea what a split E mechanism is. Some students, even if they have it, they don't know exactly what it is or what it does. So that's what we're going to talk about today. What the split E mechanism actually does to your flute, why you might want one, and if you don't have one, the things that you can do for your high E to compensate to make it sound better. First of all, let's look at what your split E mechanism actually physically does on your flute. And to start this discussion, we're going to look at the various keys that you have on your flute. I'm sure you've noticed that on your flute you have a lot more tone holes and keys and levers than you actually have fingers. And we need to thank our flute grandpa, Theobald Böhm, for this. Böhm lived in the 1800s, and in the early to mid 1800s, he added a lot of tone holes and keys and levers to your flute. He did this to avoid compromises, because before his time, a lot of the notes on the flute were made by putting down a finger where it could fit. So, for instance, if you look at how we play G, when you add your left hand third finger to play G, we have not one but two keys that go down. We have a few keys that we never physically touch, but the mechanism makes them go down. And this, as I said, is to avoid a compromise, because we want the flute tube to close exactly there to get a really nice, in tune, acoustically great sounding G. But our finger can't reach clear over there to close that hole for a G. So instead of having a compromise where maybe there's only one key and it's placed sort of where it's in tune and sort of where your finger can fit, Böhm went ahead and he made two keys. This is called our double G key, because when we play G, two keys go down. Similarly, if you play an F, I'm sure you've noticed that two keys go down, and that again is to avoid an acoustic or a pitch compromise on that F. Now that we've touched on that a bit, the reason that I introduced you so carefully to that double G key is that is what is involved with the split E mechanism. What your split E mechanism does, if you have one, is that it physically splits your double G keys. If you're not sure if you have a split E mechanism, you can tell, because if you do have one, you'll have this extra little rod coming out between these two keys here, like my flute has. What that does is that when I use my middle finger on my right hand and press down this key, it closes this lower G key, but not the upper one. So it's physically splitting your double G key. And the reason this helps on a high E is that if you play a high E on a normal mechanism flute that does not have a split E mechanism, neither of these two G keys go down. And that is not ideal to get a high E out. This is why flutists dislike high E so much. There's a reason that high E is not vented quite ideally. In an ideal world, the only vent that we want for that high E is this one upper G key. You want your lower G to be closed so that the flute doesn't have too many open holes. So when I play high E, because I do have that split E mechanism, you'll see that my lower G closes, and the only key that's left standing open is this upper G key. This gives me a little advantage on my high E's. It means the E comes out with more ease, especially when I'm leaping to it. Say I'm leaping from an A up to an E, that's especially helped. The E is also a little better in tune. It works acoustically a little bit better, so it just sounds a little bit nicer. So if you play a G and you have a split E mechanism, the G is completely normal. But then when you play a high E, we get this key closed, which is a nice bonus just to help that high E come out. I'm especially spoiled with my split E key because normally you only get split E keys if your flute has an offset G. My flute has inline G, and most flute makers refuse to make split E's if the G is in line. In fact, when I was growing up, an offset G was thought of as more a student kind of flute because it was easier for small hands to reach that G. But the offset G has become much more popular, I think partly because people with smaller hands become professional flutists. There are a lot more women professional flutists these days. But also, nowadays, people want that split E mechanism, and as I say, usually you can't get one unless you have an offset G. I've been spoiled because first, Williams Flutes Company specifically made a flute for me with an inline G and a split E, and then Burkhart Flutes, which is what I'm playing now, did the same thing for me, but that is a very special order. So thank you, Williams Flutes Company and Burkhart Flutes, for spoiling me with an inline G and a split E key. But I went 22 years without having a split E, so you don't need one. It's just a very nice perk to have. You can get one with any level of flute, whether it's beginner, intermediate, or the most advanced professional models. How much it will cost depends on the flute. If you're starting with a student flute, it might only cost you $200 or so, up to over $1,000 if you're getting a really high-end gold or platinum flute. Just depends on the metal and the make of the flute. If you're thinking to yourself, I wish I had a split E, but I didn't get one with my flute and I can't go buy a whole new flute just to ask for a split E mechanism, that is very sensible and I'm proud of you. Wait until it's time to get a new flute before you deal with that. In the meantime, you can try, if you want, something called a split E Facilitator, something that a flute maker, manufacturer, or a repair person can put into your lower G key. You can get one that's shaped like a disc or a donut, so it goes around the edge of the tone hole with a hole in the middle of it. It looks like a donut. There's also a kind that looks more like a half moon. Either way, it just closes off that lower G tone hole a bit so that when you're playing your high E, it vents a little bit less, mimicking what the split E mechanism does. It just doesn't quite close that off as completely, obviously. It is something that you want a flute manufacturer or repair person to do for you rather than trying to put it in yourself, because the flute mechanism is really delicate. We don't want to mess around with it unless we really know what we're doing. Aside from that, no matter what your circumstances are with having a split E mechanism or facilitator or nothing, we want to learn all the tricks that we can to make that high E sound great. So how about you like my video, subscribe if you haven't, ring the notification bell, and then I'll give you a few tricks to make your high E sound better. How's that? Did you like my video? Okay, I'll assume that you did, and I will give you a couple of tricks. The main one is that on the high E, it can really help it to take off your right hand fourth finger. Many flutists treat this as the standard high E fingering with no right hand fourth finger. It vents one less key, and even though it's pretty far down the tube, it does increase your flute's stability. It brings the pitch down a little bit, and it makes that E a little bit less fragile. Another trick you can use for soft high E's, especially soft high E entrances, is you can barely tap down your second trill key with your right hand third finger. you have to be careful because if you put it down too far, it opens up this top trill key and it makes the E not sound as good. But if you just barely crack that trill key open, it can give you a nice controlled E that will never crack down to the low A, which is what we're afraid of when we start a soft high E. My all-time favorite place to vent this second trill key just a little bit is the very opening of the Poulenc Flute Sonata. Even though that's an incredibly beautiful sonata that we have many flutists kind of dread starting it because we start on that delicate soft high E. But if you barely crack open that second trill key, you can play it as softly as you want. High E can be great for us because it can force us to have a great support and a great basic setup, or it's not going to come out right. So if you're having trouble with your high E, tell yourself your high E problems are going to make everything work better. It's going to force you to relax and open up and breathe deep and support so that your entire high register comes out better. Aside from those tricks, there's some psychology that you can use for reluctant notes on your flute, like this high E and some others. And this video is getting too long for me to delve into all of that right now. So I'm going to talk about the psychology of difficult notes and how to use psychology to make these awkward notes and awkward registers work better for us. But I'm going to save that for next week. So you'll just have to wait patiently, come back next week and see what I have to say about this final trick to play a great high E, as well as make a lot of other problem notes and registers sound better. Come back next week.